E aku nui, e aku rahi, tēnei o ki rā te mihi a Karanga Aotearoa ki a tātou te iwi ko patau nei, ki raro i te tuanui o te Papa Tongarewa. O tira kia koutou katoa kei waho ke e pāpaho mai ana ki roto i tēnei whakāturanga i te rangi nei. Welcome everybody. Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Arikirangi Mamaku-Ironside and I'm the Acting Head of Repatriation for Te Papa and Karanga Aotearoa. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. While the campaign by whānau has been decades in the making, the physical and spiritual journey back to Aotearoa for 64 Māori and Moriori tūpuna and karāpuna started actually last week on Tuesday the 27th of September with a handover ceremony at the beautiful Natural History Museum in Vienna in Austria. And our Te Papa had a small delegation that was led by Dr. Arapata Hakiwai, who's the kaihautu or the Māori co-leader for Te Papa Tongarewa. And we were also led by His Excellency Brian Hewson, who's the ambassador, a New Zealand ambassador to Austria there in Vienna. And at the ceremony, we were joined by representatives of the Austrian government and also Dr. Katarina Voller, the Director General for the Natural History Museum, as well as staff of the Anthropology Department. And as you can see, it was a bit of a whirlwind tour. So we had the ceremony on the 27th, and then the ancestors and our group departed on the 28th, the following day. Landed into Auckland on the 30th, and then had the ancestors in karakia and quarantine on the 1st of October. And then it all culminated to a big, beautiful welcome on Rongo where we were joined by iwi, hapu and whānau that are associated with these ancestors that were stolen over a century ago. A few short days later, we had, of course, the tūpuna. We were joined by 250 Māori and Moriori from Te Wharetapu o Ngāpuhi, Whangaroa, Whanganui, and Rekoi Wharekauri. And together we welcome these ancestors home after being taken away such a long time ago. Before we start, a little housekeeping. Emergency exits are well lit, and our staff will be happy to guide you in case there is an emergency. Restrooms are just on the outside of the theatre, just to the left-hand side there. And photography is perfectly fine. However, just be a little bit mindful about using flash, or if you can, just avoid using the flash. Our events will have our guest lecture present 40 to 45 minutes, Professor Dr. Sabine, after which a panel discussion will follow where we'll be joined by Dr. Amber Aranui and also a special guest, Tumu Whakarai, Chief Executive for Te Papa, Courtney Johnston. E hoama, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer all the way from the Natural History Museum in Vienna. Laura homai kua te pakipaki, please put your hands together for Professor Dr. Sabine Eggers.
Oops. Good morning, everybody. Kia ora. I'm very, very, very happy to be here today. I'm very happy to be here in New Zealand, and I thank you very much, Arikirangi, for your kind introduction. And yes, I would like to tell you a bit about the research and about this long, 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 long way home the tūpuna, the ancestors, made from Vienna until Wellington. Just the other day. So what I put together here for you is, well, the Natural History Museum as it looked like quite some time ago. And here, just to tell you that ancestors are not only very, 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 very important for people in New Zealand, they are also for me. And so this is a drawing by my mother. And she was an artist, and this was the first dead person she saw. And she was very concerned about it because it was a very, very dear friend. And here I have a drawing of a person I don't know, but I like the drawing very much because I thought it somehow shows respect towards the dead, although it shows a dead. So about this ambiguity, I'm going to try to talk a bit to you today. So as Te Arikirangi mentioned before, the repatriation ceremony at the Natural History Museum had taken place on the 27th of September. Just last week. It was a very beautiful ceremony, I think, but it was nothing if compared to the one we had on Sunday here. But even though it was very important. And I wanted to tell you something about, well, what has Austria got to do with New Zealand? What has Austria got with colonialism and so on? How did these things happen in such a big museum as the Natural History Museum of Vienna? So creating collections with minerals, with plants, with animals, with archaeological remains, like this one here, for instance, which is the most important archaeological treasure we have in the Natural History Museum. You might find it a bit strange, but she's the Venus from Willendorf, who was excavated in the vicinity of Vienna, and she dates back to 32,000 years, so she's really very old. And people are still discussing what her meaning was. And so all these kinds of objects have been collected in the last 200, 300 years, more or less, for the Natural History Museum. But not only these kinds of objects, as you know, so also human remains from all over the world, which is a very complicated issue. And so you can see here a picture that from the museum in Linz, that's a city in Austria as well, where you can see somebody, and we don't know, I don't know who this somebody is, maybe you can help me to decipher it, and all those white spots, in fact, are human remains. So this photograph was taken here in New Zealand, and yeah, depicts how European people were eager to find loot, to steal human remains from other regions and bring them back to the Natural History Museum in Vienna. And why that? In fact, it was for science to rescue endangered species, to describe diversity, to construct taxonomies, and finally to understand evolution and make exhibitions and participate in educational programs. And here you can see a part of the architecture of the Natural History Museum, where you can see this little animal here holding Darwin's book on evolution from 1859, and the little baby being shown a mirror by this other chap here, and being very ashamed of it, because you might remember that in the beginning of evolutionary theory, people were very much against it and said, well, we descend from apes, how that, and so on. So this is one of the things that are depicted in the architecture of the Natural History Museum, and which somehow shows what the intents were right from the beginning. But in this museum we have today 30 million items. This is a huge amount of plants, of animals, of minerals, and of human remains as well. So is it also a demonstration of power? If you look at the architecture of the Natural History Museum, that is just across a museum that looks more or less the same, and it's built in conjunction, let's say, to the big castle of the Habsburgs. So it has something to do with demonstration of power, certainly. And yes, but how is colonialism connected to Austria? Because almost all Austrians will say, well, but Austria had no colonies, so how come? And in fact, Austria had a little tiny batch, let's say, of one of the Nicobar Islands during a couple of years, and that was all. But does it mean then that Austria has nothing at all to do with colonialism? So we don't think so, because we see that there was a wishing for colonial power, and we are going to discuss this in relation to some of the expeditions Austria has launched. We also can see that the mindset and the helping other colonial powers was also carried out by Austrian scientists, by Austrian politicians, and so on. And Austria was also acting as a colonial power. So these things are being discussed now in Austria much more intensively than they have been in the past, especially also because there is a very important historian, Walter Sauer, who's making these issues very clear. And you can see in the architecture outside the walls, let's see, of the Natural History Museum in Vienna, you see this depiction here, this statue here, which represents America and Australia, and here you see the old James Cook. And yes, and so what about the anthropological collection at the Natural History Museum? So it's important to note that today the anthropological collection holds mainly human remains, casts, photographs of taken of people in different kinds of situation, and somatological material, let's see, measurements and things like that. And all the ethnographical work and items that have been taken from all over the world, they are now housed in the Weltmuseum, and in fact since the beginning of last century, so in 1926. Oops, so sorry. Okay, it's going to be like that. So we have human remains in the anthropological collection of more than 40,000 individuals. The aim was, when this collection was built, was to describe human variation, to also try to describe human races, based on the morphology, the size, and the form of the skulls, but also to classify those races hierarchically. And obviously this gave way to racist research and to racist mindsets that have had horrible consequences, you know, and they are still there. And here you can see the kind of exhibition that was in place until the 19th of the last century, where different people of different regions of the world, here South America, I'm from Brazil, so yeah, and where there were also photographs, not only photographs, but the human remains shown to the public. And this obviously not only about South America, but other regions of the world, including the Pacific regions. And then people began to be very angry at this until there was a publication in Science, which is in Nature, which is one of the most important scientific journals, saying that the exhibition on anthropology of the Natural History Museum is really something like Nazi racist. And yes, and then this race hall, how it was called, was closed after these protests in '96, and it reopened only in 2013, and it was then on human evolution, so a completely different kind of theme, where only casts were used, and the whole history is about, well, what happened, I don't know, from 6 million years ago until the dawn of Homo sapiens, more or less. So the whole discussion about exhibiting human remains, about classifying them or describing the human variety today was avoided. And then, in the context of especially of provenance research related to the National Socialism in Austria, a very, very important work began with Margit Berner, my colleague at the Anthropology Department at the Natural History Museum in Vienna, on especially on photographs that she has found in our department. It was just a little tiny box with photographs of people, and it was saying Tarnov Jews and this date. And so she was able to reconstruct whose pictures these were, by whom they have been taken, and what for. They had been taken by two women scientists, and they have been taken just during the Nazi regime to try to find out which would be the morphology typical of Jews from this ghetto in Tarnov. So a very racist, horrible kind of research. But Margit then did a very important and beautiful, can one say beautiful? No, aesthetic, but very informative exhibition on those photographs called The Cold Eye, and it's now traveling through Europe. So this was the beginning of provenance research in the Department of Anthropology, so starting from the 1990s. 20 years after that almost, there was a big project called Four Museums, aimed at discovering who collected human remains for this collection, which human remains were there, etc. But there is, until now, no publication on those results, and no repatriation was carried out based on those results. I mean, there are no results published. And then, very importantly, in 2017, there was a visit of these people, you probably know very well, to our museum, asking to visit the ancestors. So this was exactly the same. I came from Brazil to Vienna, and it was something that was really very, very important for me, for us, because it showed another kind of work that was possible to be carried out in anthropology, in biological anthropology, let's say, in a department of biological anthropology, and which makes sense for people today, and much sense for people today. No? So after that, we began making our research on that. I'm going to show you then just very quickly how it went. But what is important also is to see how then discussion began to be a bit more widespread, let's say. So we had a workshop organized by the ministry in Austria on the museum in colonial context. We had then the beginning of the formal master students interested in colonial studies. And we have now, in the last couple of years, the possibility to have a funded project on colonialism in the museum, so where these things are being researched and are going to be published then in the next couple of years. And since this year, there is an Austrian expert committee on provenance working a lot on these issues as well. And I forgot to say about this exhibition here on dead images. That was something that also connected us from the Natural History Museum to people of Te Papa back in Edinburgh. Yeah. And when you ask me now what happened regarding exhibitions in the Natural History Museum and what has something to do with colonialism, we have now, since the beginning of the year, an exposition on Brazil because of the bicentennial of Brazil's independence of Portugal, so a very colonial subject. And we had some colonial aspects on this, or still have on this exhibition, like photographs on and information on slavery, which was very important in Brazil. And so racism still is there a big issue. And we had some inputs, and unfortunately not as many as I wished, from communities of origin from Brazil. So this is something that, is probably going to be explored in the next couple of years, I think. And we are now beginning with, to try to study this colonial mindset of Austria in relation to its own crown countries. Because as you know, Austria is very tiny today, but was in the past a powerful imperium. And how did they then deal with their inland colonies, let's say? And this is a difficult aspect as well, and this is being researched now by Constanze Schatke, a student of our department. And yes, when we look at the anthropological collection and the collections that were collected, let's say, in the past, we see a great shift from these years to those years here. So in the beginning, we had quite a lot here of human remains that had been taken from other countries than Austria and the Crown lands. And after 1918, this shifted. So there were many more human remains taken from Austrian sites than from outside the country. And here we have human remains taken and stolen from Hawaii, Tierra del Fuego, and New Zealand. And if you look at the distribution today, until 1935, of the human remains we have in this department, we see that the greatest part is of Austria and of Europe, and that we have only little part, let's say, well, one part that has to do with eventually with colonial context. Here it's important to say that this bigger chunk here on Africa in fact relates to Egypt, but there were very many excavations led by Austrian scientists and archaeological excavations led by Austrian scientists to Egypt. So in fact this slice of Africa that is not from archaeological collections, and in this thus stealing of human remains is not as big as shown here. Oops, sorry. Doesn't want to go back? Yeah, here. And you might not know, but there is a big connection of New Zealand. A big connection. There is something like a Wikipedia of New Zealand in the old Natural History Museum of Vienna. Why do I say Wikipedia? Because there are at least those 5 beautiful paintings on New Zealand landscapes. Landscapes and animals you probably can recognize related to New Zealand. But why? Just because one of the first director of the Natural History Museum, Hofstetter, was somebody very fond of New Zealand and has spent a couple of years here. And as you can see, he as a first director, requested this painting to be made, and especially also to be made with those New Zealand treasures here. So there is this big connection of the museum, of the art of the museum that is just in the collection, in the exhibition rooms that relates Austria to New Zealand. And so we have these caryatids as well. And here I want to just show you how long and complicated the process was until the repatriation of the tūpuna the other day here. So it began, the first attempts were made back in 1945, but did not even reach Austria. Then there was the repatriation finally of the mummy of Tupahau by Hans Peter, who was then the director of the Weltmuseum, the Ethnographic Museum in Vienna. In 1997, there was an inquiry by tūpuna that didn't have any kind of result. Then 2003, the Papa was organized with this repatriation program, which is absolutely important. Then we had this project for Muse that didn't give any results. Then in 2013, Narapata Hakiwai requested provenance research, and it was responded by the anthropological department, yes, we are going to make some research, and they did. It took 1 year, which was quite quick. But no repatriation resulted from that. Then there was another request from Paco to the Weltmuseum. And in 2015, then the Weltmuseum finally returns some artifacts with human remains. You have perhaps witnessed here. Sorry for my English, by the way. And yes, and then we have this important visit by the Papa to the Natural History Museum when I came over, and then I said, okay, let's try and make things happen now. And then we had some meetings, so we had lots of contact per email. We had this meeting I was telling you about before in Edinburgh on the Dead Images conferences, where for me as a bioarchaeologist and anthropologist and somebody who was working in medical genetic back in Brazil, all these encounters had been very, very important for me to somehow try to grasp, somehow understand what the meaning was for Aotearoa, and this is especially for the Māori, in having their ancestors returned. So we met again at the repatriation of the Charité in Berlin. Then we sat down and wrote a chapter on the findings we had on the collection in Vienna, and now we have the repatriation finally. So who has looted and stolen human remains from New Zealand for the Natural History Museum in Vienna? So as Arikirangi said, we have 7 convolutes. Convolutes are something like groups, and they were classified like that, in fact arbitrarily, because they don't really are very good classifications of it, but we retained it like that. So we have 7 groups, one of the exhibition Novara I'm going to tell you about, one that were transported by the ship Fasana, another one by Haast, by the Crown Prince Rudolf, something about the bell convolute, and a sailor, and we only know his name, and then the big convolute stolen by Reischek. So in fact, of the human remains of 64 ancestors, 49 have been looted by Reischek. But in the whole, there are more than 15 collectors and tracers involved in looting these human remains. So if we talk about the Novara, this big ship here, this is a nickname one gives to the first circumnavigation with an Austrian flag, and where very many sailors were on board and very many scientists as well. And the ancestors stolen then, and they have not only been stolen from New Zealand, but from other countries as well. So human remains of more than 100 people were stolen during this exhibition. And so these 2 persons here, they wrote on the ancestors, on the New Zealand ancestors, but on the others as well. And very important to note here is that there were instructions for the scientists of how to collect and what to collect, what to steal and how to steal. And so it's really impressive that one can see that the instructions to the scientists were, well, should it be possible to get hold of skulls of various human races, the naturalists are requested to collect from all races whatever they can, and in New Zealand, especially those that were tattooed. And another thing is very important about those instructions, which is these instructions here on human remains are just in the middle of the instructions to get animals, to shoot animals, birds, whatever, to take their skins off and so on. So it's a very strange kind of dealing with ancestors, with human remains. Strange, horrible. No? Yes, and here you can take a look at the four most important people related to the human remains of this Novara circumnavigation. We call it the New Zealand connection. So we have this Ferdinand Hochstetter, who was supposed then to be the director, the first director of the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and who was at the Novara and decided to leave it and stay in New Zealand for longer than expected to explore its geology. And he worked together with Julius Haast, who was the director then of the Canterbury Museum. And Haast later employed Reischek, and Reischek, in fact, was somebody Hochstetter knew from a war. They had been together. And so when Haast said he needed somebody to help him with an exhibition in the Canterbury Museum, Hochstetter said, okay, I'm going to recommend you Reischek. So those two people were responsible for making Reischek travel from Austria to New Zealand. And there is somebody else that is very well known to you, who's Purhas, who also was engaged in the in the geological research, although he was also a surgeon, a scientist, a musician, and so on. And Fischer was also somebody very, very much involved with all these things, because although he was a physician and a homeopath, he apparently was very successful with that and was able to finance the Canterbury Museum. So you see how many collections people are somehow related in this. And if we look further, we can see that Charles Heafy, for instance, was somebody who was working together on the geological expeditions with Hochstetter, with Haast, and with Purhas. And that Scherzer was the one who was leading the scientific group of the Novara expedition, and he was then also related to Edward, not related, but working together with Edward Schwartz, because Schwartz helped Scherzer to write about it. And Frauenfeld was the person responsible for the exhibition of the Novara collections in Trieste. So it was the first time that also the New Zealand ancestors were exposed and exhibited. So, and here you can see the depictions of the people who wrote on these ancestors that have been collected by the Novara. So this was a convolute on the Novara. And there is a little convolute only of one ancestor that had been donated by this Dr. J.W. Bell, and that was inventoried at the University of Vienna, and then later was part of the pathological collection of the Natural History Museum in Vienna, which looks like a Kugelhupf, like a cake. And it's nicknamed like that, or as Narrenturm, which is a horrible denomination because it says that's the tower of the crazy people. And in fact, this building was built to try to aid people with psychiatric conditions. So, not a nice name. Okay. And so this bell convolute then in fact relates to only, is associated to only one ancestor that was looted from a battlefield. There, as I told you before, there was this troutman, the salesman. However, we know that he has somehow transported, was responsible for donating the remains of one ancestor to the Natural History Museum, but we do not know where he got these human remains from and how. The other one relates to also only one ancestor whose location where he was looted from is unknown, but who was transported also by the Fasana convolute like the other one before. And there is a Haast convolute, the same Haast, the director of the Canterbury Museum, and he gifted, apparently the remains of two ancestors. At least one of them was a complete skeleton. Why a complete skeleton, we do not know. Where from, we also do not know exactly. But in any case, we only have had in the Natural History Museum one cranium, and have only repatriated this one to Te Papa the other day. There is the convolute on Prince Rudolf, where Hochstetter, the one who was then the first director of the Natural History Museum, was in fact his science tutor. And this Crown Prince Rudolf, he was very much much more interested in science than in politics, in fact, and had a very dramatic and short life. But he was very keen on science, so he had remains of two ancestors, one from Chatham Islands and another one from the South Islands. And when Zuckerkandl, one of the gentlemen who wrote about the Novara human remains, he wrote also that he was very happy that he could include those human remains of the collection of Prince Rudolf into his description. And that it was very important because he thought that the Chatham Islanders were almost extinct at that time. And it still prevails in the head of many people. No? And so, and here is the convolute of Andreas Reischek, who stayed then 12 years in New Zealand, although in fact he should have stayed only 2 years, but then he financed his voyages, his expeditions, and his travels and his survival here by working, by trading what he had looted and collected. And yes, and so he's responsible for looting the remains of 49 ancestors. And yeah, when we knew about this, and this is the kind of entry we have in our inventory books, so we were able to see, okay, the individual with the number so-and-so was looted from the place so-and-so, but didn't know very much more about how Reischek came to loot that. And we noted as well there was a certain Mr. A, and it took us some time to discover that Mr. A was Karl Auspitz, a dermatologist who was able to buy Reischek's collection when he went back to Austria, and then to donate it to the Natural History Museum. So we had some work done here. And then it was very important that we got the possibility through Margit Berner and the Weltmuseum to, for the first time, analyze the scans of the original diaries written by Reischek. And this is important, which is housed in this museum here in Linz. And this is very important because the books that were published by Reischek's son, first in German and then in English, and had very, very many editions afterwards, were in fact romanticized and censored and so on. So in fact, what this son has written about Reischek is not as concrete, let's say, on his looting activities as we discovered after were his original diaries. So we thought it was really a very, very good opportunity for us to try to discover new things about Reischek looking at his diaries. But it was difficult. I mean, we had 1,500 pages of things written like that, and which is difficult to read. It's a mixture of German and English. There's no point, nor orthography. The handwriting is very difficult to read, and it's very confusing somehow. No? And so we proceeded to try to make a list of keywords, and then we had 5 very brave students that helped us with going through those 1,500 pages of handwritten diaries and to try to discover these, keywords like that: Maori, kitchen midden, skull, crevice, battlefield, hollow tree, etc. And when we discovered those keywords, then we went back and forth to see, okay, what is he now describing? When was it? Why was it? How was it? And so we could discover some details. I'm going to skip this. So things he writes here explicitly about that he was alarmed by others that entering holy places would be punished with death, but he entered anyway. No? You can see here. And so the places, the holy places he entered were, for instance, caves, where he thought or he knew that people were buried there. And here you see a painting by Mihi, one of those guys who was involved with the Nevada expedition. So this is only to show how intricate all these associations of people were at that time. Yeah, and not only that, Reischek also said that he was told not to take anything, like, for instance, ethnographic objects from Tapu Maori villages, even if they were abandoned. But he writes then, well, he would not decline of doing that when he would have the chance to do it, just because he wanted it for scientific purposes. And then he writes also things like, after he was certain there were no natives looking at him or seeing him, he would take ethnographic objects like this totora post, a carved totora post, and other ethnographic items. And he also wrote that he was exchanging those looted ethnographic objects for human remains. So he makes a little list here that of ethnographic objects he had exchanged for 6 Maori skulls. And he also makes a list of the places he looted those human remains from. So from caves, from crevices, hollow trees, battlefields, and kitchen midden. No? That is, from tapu places, in fact, no? Where no one is allowed to enter, and he was absolutely conscious about that these places were tapu and that he could not enter, that he should not enter, that he should not have taken anything from there, but he did it anyway. No? And even when he was alarmed by, for instance, by Dobson, who seems to have been an acquaintance of him, maybe you have more information, Amber, on him. We only think he's an engineer, but okay. So Dobson told him, well, you can get killed if the natives are going to see you with skulls, human skulls in your backpack. And he said something like, well, let me deal with that, and just hid the backpack with the skulls and took it to somewhere else when nobody was there to see it. So in fact, this context of injustice, of how he collected human remains, and is absolutely clear from his diaries. So he was well aware that he was breaking the taboos. He excavated, collected, robbed, hid, traded, transported away, and bequeathed to the Natural History Museum in Vienna human remains from Aotearoa sacred places in exchange for science, monetary gifts. And his cunning, in fact, enabled him to escape even the death penalty. And yes, and where are we now? Fortunately, there is this man called August Walch, who is a preparator in our anthropological department back in Vienna, who is painstakingly transcribing those handwritten diaries. So we have all these transcribed already. It's not the totality, because we said, okay, please begin with transcribing those that have something to do with human remains, because Reischek was an ornithologist, an amateur ornithologist, and collected lots of birds and animals and minerals and plants and so on and so on. And it's necessary for a person, or for persons with these kinds of expertises to transcribe it, because he wrote in such a horrible handwriting that you need to know the scientific names in order to decipher them in his diaries. So that's where we are now. So happily, we can now scan and make more systematic research. So what do we have to still do? Lots of things, lots. We need more details on Reischek's attitudes. We would very much like to match his voyages and travels with the places where he looted ancestors from, so matching what we know with what is written on his diaries, and we still have to discover. Then discover especially what iwi were affected by his and other people's lootings. This is not clear for the great majority of ancestors, unfortunately. And as I told you, there are some of the ancestors whose location, where they were looted from, is totally unknown. So we have to find a way to discover to which iwi they belong. And we would very much like to do that in the combination of traditional knowledge and archival research, which is probably, hopefully, going to be carried out in the next couple of, years or something. And so we are thinking about making a memorandum of understanding between both of our museums to try to figure out these things in a better way, in the best way possible. So thank you very much. And that's it. Thank you. So I think the lights have to be turned.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, and this, yeah, okay, good.
Please help me thank Dr. Sabine Eggers for her presentation. Right now we're just inviting our small panelists to come forward. We have, with the stunning red hair, Dr. Amber Aranui, curator, Mātauranga Māori. Joined by Tumu Whakarai Courtney Johnston. And of course, our very special guest, Professor Dr. Sabine Eggers. Hello. All the way from this side. It feels a little bit strange. Feels like a little game show. Contestant number 1. Sorry. I guess where we can start from is just the most recent event, which was the pōhiri. And as mentioned before, we had over 250 Māori and Moriori descendant communities here to help bring their ancestors and welcome their ancestors back home to Aotearoa after they were taken for such a long time. So my first question is for you, Professor Sabine Eggers. Just Sabine. Okay, Sabine. First name basis. Sabine, of course, welcome to Aotearoa, New Zealand. I want to explore some of your thoughts and feelings following the repatriation pōhiri for these ancestors and some of their descendants. As a European anthropologist, it must have been quite an experience for you. What was the experience like?
Oh, yes, is it on? Yes, okay. Yeah, well, the experience was overwhelming, I think, is the first thing that comes to my mind. It was so intense, it was so beautiful, it was so clear somehow. Even I don't speak Māori, unfortunately. And when the iwi was talking and singing and praying, I somehow had the feeling, now he's saying something, he's being really very angry about this whole situation, of course, of the looting of the human remains. And then in some moments I had the feeling, now they are crying about it. They're very sad about the absence of these ancestors for so many years. And then sometimes I had the impression, that must be something very joyful. Not only because people were laughing, before they were laughing, because the kind of songs was, I don't know, very enlightening somehow. So I thought I found this very interesting, how clear and how structured feelings are or can be expressed. So I thought this was really very nice. And I wondered, all the women who came in first and who were sitting in front and near to the tūpuna, they had a very special kind of role. I still have to talk to you to discover exactly which role this is or was. So in the whole, for me, it was astonishing to see how many people were present, how intense those feelings were, and how much other people have to learn from this. Other people, I mean European people, I mean, for instance, when we talk about the indigenous communities in Brazil, there are many, and very many different, hundreds of indigenous Brazilian, indigenous languages are spoken in that what is Brazil today. But unfortunately, they're not as structured, they're not as well organized as Māori and Moriori are here. So I think this would be a great opportunity for people, for communities of origin in the whole world to see how these things are handled here by you in order to empower them. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you for that. I was just reflecting on the experience in Vienna last week at the Natural History Museum, and so it was obviously quite different to the pōhiri that we had here at Te Papa on Sunday, but just to be surrounded by the opulence of the Natural History Museum, which was kind of like peak imperialism, you knew how much money the Habsburg whānau had in those days, and expressed through their architecture, understandably, because looted stuff from all over the place. But for me, I felt actually that was also quite moving as well. In Māori culture, we have a practice where a speech is followed up by a song. He waiata, he kinaki, right? The speeches for Dr. Katrine Voller, who's the Director General for the Natural History Museum, and also Jürgen Meinl from the Ministry, and Professor Dr. Sabine Eggers, they have this beautiful choir of young people that had come to sing their waiata as an accompaniment. And so you can just imagine these beautiful Bach and Mozart just kind of like resonating throughout the halls of the Natural History Museum to farewell these ancestors farewell these ancestors. So I thought that was actually quite special, and something quite unique to experience. So I wanted to thank the museum as well for creating that atmosphere for us. Courtney, so same question. So for this particular pōheri, you actually joined the whānau hapu and iwi in bringing the ancestors onto the marae, which is the other side that you're actually usually used to. So can you just share with us some reflections about that?
Yeah, kia ora everyone. I was so not the first time that I've been involved in supporting repatriation pōheri here at Te Papa, but the first time that I've been a pallbearer. And every one of these repatriations is humbling, but I think this one especially so. I think, and I've talked to other colleagues, other Pākehā colleagues who got to be part of that, because first up, there are things that you experience that you don't know about or you've never heard about, and for me it was carrying the archival box with the tūpuna inside and feeling the box vibrate to the sound of the karakia and to the taonga pūro. And I didn't know that happened, and none of us talked about that on the day, but we all talked about it afterwards. And I think for me, because it puts you in the position as a Pākehā person of thinking about how am I implicated, what is my role, what is the system that has brought me to this point. And as I kind of worked through that, as we were moving from the dockway up to the marae, and then from the marae to the to the wahitapu, I guess I kind of realised it's not about me, and it's not my job to centre myself at this moment, because I'm here personally and professionally in a position of support, and to the point that you make, Sabine, to be part of a process that is about processing deeply held, long-standing trauma and helping collectives and communities and individuals find another side on that, and that, Māori and Moriori are at the centre of this, but actually all New Zealanders or anyone who lives in a country that has been affected by this, we are swept up in that processing of this trauma and the healing that comes out of it, and regardless of who you are, you become a beneficiary of what this mahi of repatriation does. So I guess I went through that deeply self-conscious moment at the beginning of proceedings, and then came to this point of finding myself not pushed to the edges, but in a place of kind of comfort of knowing what my role of support was. But for me, the bit that I will never ever forget is feeling that box vibrating in my hands as it came home.
Kia ora. I think you make a really interesting point around how far there's a responsibility, how far there's a role actually extends. And our repatriation program has 3 people in the team. So myself as acting head of repatriation, Te Rikiki Herewini, who's the permanent head of repatriation, and Suzanne Thorpe. But these programs are often a lot larger than the individuals that are deeply involved in them, and also the individuals that have played significant roles in the journey. Because as you can see with Sabine's presentation, all of these discussions and negotiations has just been going on for such a long time. And interestingly enough, what you just said is that it's almost not a national responsibility, but everybody gets to kind of like carry this journey, to walk this journey. And I think it was just a really, really beautiful opportunity for you and Minister Kiritapu Allen, and some of our directors throughout the museum, to actually get that experience on what the perception is like, what the feeling is like from the community side. And these are very much, reflecting on from the perspective of the victims of these intergenerational traumas and crimes. So tēnā koe, Courtney. Amber,
Amber and I go way back. Amber started with Karanga Aotearoa probably 2 years before I did, just 1 year, 2008. And Amber's migrated, but to another part of the museum, focusing on Taonga repatriation, which is also very, very fantastic. So this is the evolution of our work and how it's actually shifted and changed over the years. So I just had a question for you, Amber. So you've attended and supported well over a dozen repatriation pōhiri. How was this one for you compared to previous pōhiri?
Yeah, I think first and foremost it was being able to perform the haka pōhiri. It's been a few years since we've done that. Sorry, I was going to try not to cry, but gets me every time. Yeah, so it's been a number of years since we've done haka pōhiri to the tūpuna. And it was quite, I don't know, it was a bit emotional for me just because I knew quite a lot about the tūpuna that were coming home. So, yeah, it was good to see. It's like happy tears. The other thing I think for me was to see how many hapu were there. And though we often have a number of hapu come, but I guess it also reflects on how much we knew about these tūpuna. Which, you know, is really great to see. But one thing that I really loved to see actually at this pōhiri was the number of descendants for those tūpuna sitting around there, keeping them warm. Well, we have that process, and I guess that's one of the roles of those wahine. Usually, you know, I sit there with the tūpuna, but I thought, no, this time I want to sort of sit back and give that space, you know, to the descendants, to the iwi and hapu that were there. It was really great to see, and yeah, and so I just hope that, you know, that continues. But the haka pōhiri was it for me. So it was great. All that te papa whānau, you know, you did really well.
Yeah, I think if we reflect on how Te Papa often comes together to welcome these ancestors home, we understand that our role is only one of kaitiaki, or we're merely just the paddlers on the canoe that's driving it. And so when we have iwi hapu whānau that are associated with these tūpuna come into Te Papa, Tūrongo Maraeroa, it's quite often the most perfect opportunity for us to actually take a step back and to create space for them to be with their tūpuna, to cry for their tūpuna, and to also carry their tūpuna onto the marae. Because also should highlight that while they're at Te Papa, when the ancestors come back from international institutions to Te Papa, they're cared for in a wāhitapu, in a dedicated wāhitapu for all of the tūpuna that come back. And it's not a permanent resting place. This is just a place where they stay while we complete all of the research and engage with the whānau hapu and iwi and Moriori community around the conditions and the situations and all of the details around how and when they go home. So I think that's also very, very important. So thank you for that first round of questions. There'll be a quiz at the end. The next one is just around. I want to talk about collectors and also provenance research. So this one's for you, Amber. Given your extensive experience in research into collectors, what type of people were driving the theft of kōiwi and kōimi tangata? And the even bigger question is why?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think, sadly for us, the main drivers throughout that process were our museums. But in the large part, the early collection of our tūpuna were scientists, and I would say that it's more opportunistic collecting rather than going out specifically looking to raid our wāhitapu. So we have botanists, we have geologists, those were the people that were involved in those early collections, specifically like Rashek, where he was there well, I guess Ryshek, and then maybe others that were paid to seek out ancestral remains that were actually brought back to museums and used to exchange for other taonga from other countries around the world. Sadly, you know, I'm not going to name museum names, but museums, for instance, would seek out burial caves where large numbers of burials, mainly skulls, were located. And people from the surrounding community were paid to go into those caves and take mainly skulls. Because at that time, Darwinism was at its peak, and the evolution of humans was, you know, a big part of scientific research at the time. So skulls were were what people were interested in. And sadly, you know, there was, I guess, orders from museums throughout the UK and Europe, you know, would write to our museum directors or curators, specifically asking for skulls of Māori and Moriori to add to their collection. So yeah, it was quite sad at that. Yeah, it's I don't know. It took me a little while to kind of come to terms with that in this mahi, but yeah, some of the things you read are quite hard. Here we go again. But you have to have a talk to yourself and say, come on now. You know, times have changed. You have to accept that, you know, they are a product of their past, they are a product of their time, and that you don't agree with it now. There's no point in being angry about it. You know, you're here to help right those wrongs. But I just kind of diverted from that question there a little bit. But yeah, I think a lot of the early collection was opportunistic in nature. It wasn't specifically to collect tūpuna, but you know, as a geologist, you would enter caves, you would study the landscape, and of course you would come across burials of all different kinds, and there's an opportunity there, so you add that to your collection.
I guess one of the, having worked in repatriation over the years, one of the things you actually notice is that there's a crime ring of individuals, right? And inside this crime ring, there are directors from the early museums, and also settlers, early settlers and early farmers, Pākehā landowners. And so there'll be these kind of exchanges, because these landowners who newly acquired whenua Māori, you know, when they're clearing the land and creating pastures for all of their animals, they come across these different waitapu. And they know the intrinsic value of ethnographic items. By ethnographic items, I'm talking about taonga and also tūpuna. And then there'll be an exchange that actually happens and goes on. The crime ring gets bigger because these directors in New Zealand actually have a network of directors, other directors in foreign institutions in Europe and the UK and also North America. And so, you know, it's just this insidious nature of this illicit collection and trade that persisted throughout much of the 19th and even the 20th century. So quite often I get asked, oh, do you want to jump in with a question?
I was just going to say, interestingly, that crime ring is almost always the same for taonga as it is for tūpuna. And though it is relatively large, you kind of know, you know, in this mahi, when you find tūpuna from overseas and you see names, you can go, oh, yep, he would have got that tūpuna from this person. So, you know, you really get to understand those personalities and who's involved with who and who was friends with who. You know, you find their letters, their diaries, you understand who their growing network is. So, though that network is relatively big, I think in the larger scheme of things, it's quite a small group of people, so we're able to trace that.
May I say something? I think, yes, you're absolutely right that so many scientists, so many people were involved with this, but especially in the name of science. So I think that I am, as I have my professional ancestors, unfortunately, in those people, in this crime ring, and so that I ought to, as a person and as a professional and as a Pākehā and as whatever, to apologize for the wrongs that have been done in the name of science. And I say science like that because, I mean, what are the real results of that? Nothing, in fact. And it is so much more important and significant what those human remains mean to people today, to their descendants, than what they could have meant for science. No? And there is this whole discussion on if repatriation somehow is making science less interesting or something, and I do not believe in that. I think we as scientists really need to apologize and really need to be very careful about all these things, and knowing what we are doing, and knowing about the cultures of the other peoples, not to infringe so many things. Because when I also think about the ceremony on Sunday, and how much the past was linked to the present and to the future as well, I was then thinking, yeah, well, and what's going to happen with the future of people like we, no? Like us? And so maybe we are also doing some things in a way that somebody else in a couple of years or something is going to find strange or whatever. But I think what at least we are trying to do from the Natural History Museum is to try to pick up the significance and the discussions of all the things that have been there in the last couple of years on repatriation and so on, and try to make our best with it, even if it means that something or the other is not the way it should be. So, sorry, I apologize.
Thank you. Well, you've answered about 3 of my questions in that one statement, so we can go. So we're doing very good for time, whānau. I found it quite interesting with your presentation, talking about the numbers of remains. Firstly, the numbers of remains at the Natural History Museum, but also where those remains actually come from. So understanding that the remains at the Natural History Museum are predominantly European. What was the reason for this?
The reason, there are various reasons. I think one of the reasons is that the expeditions were not as frequent as they in the last couple of decades than they were before. This is one thing. The other thing is that due to the expansion of cities and so on, and roads, very many cemeteries have been discovered in Austria, from Roman times, from Middle Age times, from Iron Age times, and so on. And all those human remains that have been discovered and then came to our museum to be curated there and to be analyzed there, in order to somehow make people understand perhaps how these different cultures lived there. So this was another reason. And a third one is that archaeological excavations, not only, salvage excavations? Yeah, when you do scientific archaeological excavations, they were, especially in the last couple of decades, dedicated especially to sites in Austria or around Austria, and in Egypt, as I told you.
but especially in Austria and around Austria. So this somehow then led to the results that the great majority of human remains we have in the museum are of Austrian origin. And maybe there is something else that has to be said, that for some of those cultures whose ancestors or whose bones are or skulls are in the Natural History Museum, like the Hallstatt ones, for instance, the last Hallstatt ones. Hallstatt is a very beautiful sea that is located near an excavation site called Hallstatt as well. They have salt mines there. They have explored salt mines for the last 5,000 years or something. And in the last 1,000 years or so, in the last 1,000 years, the people who had their deceased buried somewhere had to take them off because the cemetery is just very tiny, and the whole city is built on the Alps like that, and not even the trees have space enough to grow like trees. They are like I don't know, it's a very flat kind of thing, and so they had no space. And but even though they painted the skulls of their people with flowers and everything, so it was exposed, as maybe some of you know, of the catacombs or the churches in ancient Rome full of human remains. So the relation people have often, not always of course, in Europe to the bones of their family, of their, is quite another, which doesn't mean that it should be generalized to the other people. No? I don't know if I did I answer the question?
I think you answered like 15 questions. No, you're doing so well. You're doing so well. Make no apologies. So I'm also mindful of the time, and I do want to leave some time for audience questions. So I'm just going to screen my head to the last section, and it's just around talking about the way forward, where we go from here. So the first question is for Courtney. You've been tumu whakarai for Te Papa Tongarewa for 3 years now. In your time here, what are some of your observations around the work Karanga Aotearoa does, and has this evolved and changed in your eyes, in your view?
Yeah, I think my main observation from being inside the museum, actually, Amber's spoken to it here with her words and with her tears. Actually, it's the strength and the compassion and the respect of the people who conduct this work on our behalf has just, over the last 3 years, blown me away, because I don't think I, as a petty individual, could find that depth of compassion inside of me if this was the job that I did. And I can remember talking to Here about it after the first repatriation that I was part of, and just asking, how do you keep being so generous, or what you say, it's never a no, it's a not yet. How do you keep being so persistent and generous when you're carrying such a legacy of pain that was not of your making and is now something that our Māori staff have, I guess, both in some ways the privilege, but also the weighty burden of doing. And Tahiri talked to me about kind of gratitude, that righting of wrongs, to be part of something like that, and about keeping yourself safe with tikanga and with the people who you surround yourself with. But that's probably, everything else makes sense to me, and I guess, sometimes to me it's just so blindingly simple, and that's for two reasons. It's one, as a Pākehā person, I don't have a lived experience of this loss, but also as a museum professional who has grown up inside of Te Papa and doesn't have that background, it just doesn't make sense to me. The idea that a museum would want to hold on to a person because they're not done looking at it yet, it flabbergasts me. Like, these are not the rules of science that it's not like you drop an apple, it hits the ground. Museums are made up things. We made them up as tools of colonial power. We remake them for the moment that we're in, so that resistance just bewilders me. But I think Sabine laid it out. They're expressions of power and of status and of whatever the current flavour of science and research is. Sorry, this is straying somewhat, but I will circle back. So to me, I guess the gift of being my age, I do the same thing that you spoke about. I feel like I hold an inheritance in this role, and it's not just for the inheritance of the National and the Colonial Museum, it's actually the inheritance of museum practice in Aotearoa, and I see it as the greatest privilege of my role, and the greatest privilege of this museum, and the most meaningful work that we do is this healing that we get to be part of. I wonder sometimes if this is verging on the edge, but if our efforts internationally and the way that enables us to talk about the practice of other museums has possibly stopped some, or given space for museums in Aotearoa not to move as fast on our own wrongdoing, and rectifying the fact that our museums are built upon collections that hold tūpuna and karāpuna, and whilst we're out there judging international practice, maybe we haven't looked as hard at ourselves as we should have. And Ngā Kahu, that program, I think, is building the momentum around that. But when we came together earlier this year for the return of the Moriori karāpuna, and a group of museums and universities united around that, I think that is the future. It's the continuation of Karanga Aotearoa, but as you said, we are only a midpoint there, and the true goal here is always the final settling of those people back with their people and their whenua, and it's not easy. And it places enormous demand on iwi hapu whānau to partner in that. And I think resolving the inequity of resourcing there is one of the biggest jobs that faces us. But for me, it's blindingly clear. It's no longer a debate. That it was ever a debate to me is just slightly unfathomable. It is the most fundamental work we have to do as a profession, because I think it's the fundamental weakness and wrongness that we were based on, and it's not until we strip that out and heal that wound that we move into kind of our full space of serving society in the way that we can.
I think there's a large element of service that actually goes into this work, and that's the main underlying principle. It's about working in service of your ancestors, working in service of those communities that were affected by the trauma inflicted upon them, that they didn't have any choices over. Thank you, Courtney. I also want to thank you for being the director and the tumu whakarai that you are, especially understanding that, like, from our experience of dealing with directors overseas, and not a lot of them are initially receptive. It's fantastic to actually have a very, very supportive, actually across all of the levels, so from the board, with Dame Fran Wild, and yourself and Arapata, and all the way through. It's helped kind of like create this evolution for it. But I also want to acknowledge Amber, and some of the work, and a lot of the work that you have done. You can cry, it's okay. A lot of the work that you've done in establishing the framework, the national framework for museums to consider, domestic museums here in New Zealand, to consider their collections and how they behave towards their communities and hapu and whānau and iwi, understanding that, as a nation we've all got a long way to go as far as Māori Pākehā relationships go. But I think this work that we do is important in helping to drive that forward. Just super last question before we go out to the audience. Courtney, hate to put you on the spot, but I don't think I'm putting you on the spot. What's Te Papa's position on repatriation and restitution in general?
I think, as you said, from the board through, we're completely joined up behind this. Like, again, to me, it is blindingly obvious. We hold taonga. The taonga are meaningful because of the relationships. The relationships are what we care for. Therefore, the taonga goes where the relationship will be the most healthy and useful. I mean, I've got a world of reckons on this. We can talk about how just insulting I think digital repatriation is, or any number of kaupapa. But for me, the simple thing is that while museums are built on their collections, it's not hoarding that makes us what we are. And for me, a fluid boundary or a dissolving of the boundary in a relationship of care, because I also think when you return taonga, you don't relinquish your responsibility for its well-being and care just because it's gone back to community. Our relationship will evolve and that care will continue. I guess if I'm being thoughtful rather than rash, because I do like to think that everything's just, you say this is right and therefore it happens, I think we have to, it's incumbent on us to be careful to the point that you made, Sabine, that you don't want to fuck things up now and create problems for the future. So you have to be careful and you have to do the research and you have to know that your relationships are tika, because otherwise, yeah, the benefit of hindsight is that it gives us foresight. So applying that foresight in our work is really important.
In the wise words of RuPaul, don't fuck it up. Wherever possible. So we'll just edit that out. No. Let's keep it in. Let's keep it in. Please join me in putting your hands together for for our wonderful panel. Dr. Amber Aranu, Courtney Johnson, and Sabine Eggers. Now, I know it's 1:30 on the button, but I do want to open up the floor to some questions, to any questions. So, we have Heather on your right here with the microphone, and Sophie on your left there with the microphone. So, if you have a question, just pop your hand up, and they'll bring you over the microphone.
Kia ora tātou. This is a question for Sabine. Just wondering whether you've repatriated human remains to Aotearoa. Are there plans to repatriate human remains to other countries?
There are no requests until now, and I'm sure that if there are going to be some, that at least I'm going to be eager to pursue this goal. Let me put it this way. And yes, and this in relation to tūpunas or to human remains, but it's a different question if we are talking about natural history items such as animals, plants, minerals, and so on. And an even totally different different thing, which are the ethnographic or artworks. So it's in Austria. It's still a topic that is being discussed quite intensely, and people want to know that there is this big board of important people who are trying to make guidelines of how these things have to be discussed. Because in Austria and many other countries, the items of a museum don't belong to the museum, but belong to the state. No?
and so there is a whole political thing involved in all these things. So as a curator, one has unfortunately not so much power as we would very much like to have. Let's say, put it this way.
Well, the good thing is
Thank you for the question.
good thing is the cat's out of the bag, Sabine. So you know, you can't lock that one up again. I think we have a question just over there.
Kia ora, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa. O si rā ki a koe anō matua mea koutou rā kōrero. Yeah, it was really interesting, especially to see the whakapapa of the whakari that's taken place. I really appreciate being able to see that. I guess my pātai is just around the tūpuna and the karāpuna whose kāinga you don't know of. What happens to them? And same goes with taonga. Do they stay in te papa forever, or what's the pathway for them to finding a home? Kia ora.
Oh, I can jump onto that one. So when Karanga Aotearoa was founded and established in 2003, one of its mandates was to actually engage with iwi and hapu and Moriori around establishing pathways, or what happens with kōiwi tangata that we are unable to provenance to identify their locations of where they came from. And so as a result of that, there have been a number of ongoing discussions around looking at wāhi tapu that are significant on a national level. Okay, so Te Rerenga Wairua, for example, is one tono that's come forward quite a few years ago, actually, because of the significance of the location. But also, as we went through and started talking to different iwi and whānau and hapu, I didn't even know this, but like there are also other takiwā that have their own Te Rerenga Wairua, right? And like the departing place for their ancestors, Wairua, is either from their maunga or from another awa. So that needs to be considered as well. So in that situation, I guess it's an ongoing discussion. But with those ones that are unprovenance, we'll care for them at Te Papa for as long as we need to, until there's a place for them to actually go home from. But there's a beautiful concept that that our team are fleshing out, and it's just this one around a proverb for our program is tuka mai he kapunga one one ki au hei tangi. It is provide for me a handful of soil from my homeland so that I may weep over it and remember where I come from. And how we're looking at applying that into the central repository or central wāhi tapu is to ask for iwi from across the country and Oikohu to bring whenua here to be placed inside the wāhi tapu for all of these, so that no matter where they come from, they can actually connect there. And I think that's a beautiful little whakaaro there. So kia ora.
Can I just add something to that question? Just to step back a few steps from where Te Arikirangi was talking, research can take years. So I don't think we should be too quick to identify a tūpuna as being unprovenance, or don't know where they're from. And we have to take the time to do the deep dive, to do the investigation, to exert all avenues to be able to identify where this tūpuna are from. So in saying that, once we've exerted all those efforts and we cannot find that, then I think there's been some interesting whakaaro around where they go. But yeah, in terms of doing whatever we can to find out where they're from, that takes time, and it can take a village of people to do that, and that's kōrero both from the museum context, but also with iwi and hapu if we have a general location. So it can take a long time, speaking from experience.
Kia ora. We have a question at the back.
Tēnā koutou, I te tūtahi ka tuku me iki a koe te ariki, koutou hoki, Sabine, Courtney, Amber, ka tua taranaki, Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the important mahi, he mahi waka ira tēnei. Perhaps in 100 years or so, it might be only this work that is remembered. I believe that's possible. He mea tino nui ki a mātou, ngā hapu ngā iwi Māori, so nei te mihi. I wanted to share with you that no Taranaki, so South Taranaki there, my mother, who's one of 12, and all my aunties and uncles, and even us when we were all pipi and hanging out at Ngarongo and around Normanby, Hawera, one of the stories that was told to us to keep us off the roads was to keep away from the men wearing backpacks who might put us in their backpack and take us away. And kia haunei, there might be a connection there to some of those wakaaro, so my kuia would say that. So I do just want to offer that into this forum. Also, just one slight thing for me, which is that I wonder about Pākehā carrying our karāpuna, our tūpuna, back. So kia haunei, it makes sense to me that perhaps Whaia Sabine or others bringing our tūpuna home from, over the seas, that makes sense that they bring them back. I'm just not sure, and it's an uncomfortable wakaaro to share, I'm not sure why we would have Pākehā carrying them onto Rongo-Maraeroa. So, just offering that into the kōrero. I appreciate that they might be part of the mahi, but I just wonder. So, on Sunday, what was really beautiful and right and felt really good for me was to see hapu and iwi mokopuna coming to carry their own. And I just offer that into the kōrero. Kia ora rā.
I can actually jump onto that quite quickly. And I think it's, when we have a look at how we undertake our work, a lot of it's i runga i te rangi Māori me te aroha i raro i te whakarokotai. So it's a form of unity. When we have the ceremonies, and it's part of our tikangi anyway, that Karanga Aotearoa operates it, because it takes pretty much an army to enable these tūpuna to come home. So when we have the ceremonies in overseas, we usually invite the staff, the curatorial staff, the collection managers. Those people have worked inside the spaces for decades and been there kaimanaki for them. And so there's that opportunity and that role for those people to bring them on. In the situations at Te Papa and Rongo-Maraeroa, the only situations are situations of significance. And it's a humble expression and it's a humble gesture as a final gesture for these Pākehā from these institutions and from all of these different groups. It's a humble expression, and that's kei reira te whakaaro, for them to actually humbly put them down there. Because understanding as well that, as I mentioned before, Te Papa's only the halfway point. And so when we actually do take them back up home, ma te whānau anō rātou tūpuna e kawe. And so it's around about embracing all of our partners, all of these people have come together to create the situation for these tūpuna to come home, and giving them that final opportunity there. And that's just our humble expression. But do you want to?
Yeah, kia ora for your question, Aroha. And it's important to put these whakaaro out into the light where they can be answered. And I think because I was conscious of that, there were a limited number of places and I took one of them. And I guess, as a Pākehā leader of this organisation and as a woman, whenever I'm on Long Maraeroa, I'm aware that I am being accommodated and supported through tikanga. And I think that's maybe one of the arcs of Te Papa that it's gone through, is to move from expecting a place to understanding that you're being granted a place and you're being held up and supported in it. So the role I had on Sunday is not one I would have ever asked for. But when it's offered to me by the program and by the repatriation panel, and it's offered to me, I think, in the spirit of participation and learning, and possibly to deepen my understanding and commitment as a leader of this organisation and a person who is charged with decision making and upholding this kaupapa. I guess those were the two things I held in the balance when I thought about that invitation, because if I'm invited by our Māori staff to do something, I do it, do you know? Regardless of, it's not actually really about me, it's being asked in my role to do something, but I was very conscious on the day and in that moment, you know, when all the pallbearers were called forward to move down to pick up the tūpuna, I was very aware that not everyone in that group went forward, so it did weigh on me, and it's certainly not something I would automatically expect, and I don't think is automatically, you know, what did Winston Peters call them? A bauble that goes along with my role. It was something I was asked to do for this particular moment. But I totally respect your question, and I totally respect where it's coming from.
To add another layer onto that, I think, and this is the really one of the really interesting things is it requires, quite often we have these repatriations, and we all, of course, I can't identify where all of the tūpuna come from, right? We also have a very important role to ensure that all of the tūpuna come up onto the marae. There are 50 boxes, 50 skull-sized boxes that came back. And part of my job is to actually enlist the support of the te papa whānau to help carry this kaupapa. And those roles may manifest as being a pallbearer for the tūpuna. And whether or not those pallbearers are Māori or Pākehā is irrelevant, because they're all te papa whānau. And because this kaupapa here is developed by Karanga Aotearoa under the auspices of te papa, then as a whānau, we all do what we need to do to help see the kaupapa through to the end. So that's a little bit of where we actually come from there. Do we have any other questions? We'll take one more question.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Just further to what Amber was saying on provenance research, now that the tūpuna and karāpuna are back home, what is the starting point of that research? And who sort of conducts it?
I'll do something. Some of the research has already been done for some of the tūpuna. And so now it's, I guess, a matter of sharing that information with the iwi hapu and whānau to ensure that for them it's enough, that the research is good enough, it's specific enough for them to have those tūpuna come back. But for some, there's still research to be undertaken, and I guess that's going to be a relationship between te papa and the museum in Vienna.
And also, from this stage, because we had quite a few iwi hapu and whānau come in there was some reliable information to identify places of collection or theft, actually. From this stage, it's our work that we need to do, and we're going to be travelling up to Whangare in a couple of weeks to meet with the hapu and the whānau. To get their understanding of where the various wāhi tapu were that are described in Reichek's diaries. And so it's quite an ongoing process. Sometimes it's relatively straightforward, and where we can identify with certainty, with a large degree of certainty, where these tūpuna belong to, then we'll create a pathway for them to actually go home by identifying the correct iwi authority or the correct whānau to receive those tūpuna and to receive them home. Kapai. Well, okay, so we are 15 minutes into bonus time. Please join me in thanking again all of our presenters. and Dr. Sabine Eggers. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, and we'll be publishing the video at some point in the future. So kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.